The captain laughed when he saw the name beside his on the flight roster. Then he refused to fly. What happened next would freeze the blood of everyone on board, because the quiet single dad sitting in the Copilot's seat was hiding a truth that would turn power, pride, and prejudice upside down in one breathtaking moment. Before we dive in, if you love emotional stories with shocking twists and powerful lessons, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Ever Bell's Tales, where unforgettable stories take flight every single time. The morning began like any other for Captain Richard Hale, yet something in the air felt sharper, heavier, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Dawn stretched across the runway in pale gold ribbons, reflecting off polished aircraft bodies like quiet promises of control and order, things Richard valued above all else. He adjusted his captain's stripes with practiced precision, the small ritual grounding him in his authority, his years of flawless performance, his belief that the cockpit was a sacred place reserved only for those who lived and breathed aviation without distraction. As he stepped into the aircraft, the familiar scent of metal, fuel, and cold electronics welcomed him like an old friend. He settled into the captain's seat and reached for the flight manifest, scanning it casually until his eyes locked onto the name printed beside his own. Evan Brooks. The name stirred irritation instantly, like grit under his eyelid. Richard had heard whispers, too many in fact, a copilot who had taken extended leave, a man whose wife had died, a man raising a child alone. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, jaw tightening. In his mind, aviation demanded total devotion. The sky was unforgiving. One moment of distraction could mean catastrophe. He had sacrificed relationships, holidays, even the idea of family, because he believed that was the price of excellence. And now operations expected him to trust his life and the lives of hundreds of passengers to a man whose priorities were divided. As if summoned by the thought, the cockpit door opened and Evan stepped inside. He moved quietly, respectfully, his presence almost understated. His uniform was neat, but worn in a way that spoke of long days rather than neglect. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, not from carelessness but from responsibility. Evan greeted Richard with a calm, professional tone, introducing himself as if this were their first meeting, offering a small, polite smile that carried no challenge, no insecurity. Richard barely acknowledged it. He watched Evan from the corner of his eye as he stowed his bag and ran through his pre-flight checks with practiced ease. There was nothing sloppy in his movements, nothing rushed. Still, Richard felt irritation rising, fueled not by evidence but by assumption. He broke the silence with pointed questions. About Evan's time off, about his recent flight hours, about whether he felt ready to be back in the cockpit. Each question was edged with skepticism, each pause an accusation. Evan answered calmly, providing exact figures, certifications, simulator results. He never raised his voice. He never defended himself emotionally. But the more composed Evan remained, the more Richard felt his own control slipping, as if the universe itself was testing him. Finally, Richard pushed back from the controls and stood. He announced flat and loud enough for the crew outside to hear that he would not fly with a distracted copilot. The word hung in the air like smoke. Evan froze for a fraction of a second before straightening again, his expression tightening just enough to betray the sting. Outside, the hum of boarding passengers continued, blissfully unaware that their journey was stalled by pride and prejudice. Richard contacted operations, his voice clipped and authoritative, insisting on a replacement. He spoke about safety standards and responsibility, never once acknowledging the human being standing a few feet away. Evan listened in silence, his gaze drifting briefly to the windshield where the runway stretched endlessly forward. In his mind, another image overlapped it: his small apartment kitchen, his daughter Lily perched on a stool coloring airplanes with oversized wings, telling anyone who would listen that her daddy flew the biggest ones in the sky. Evan felt the familiar ache of being underestimated, not just as a pilot, but as a father. He had learned long ago that explaining himself rarely changed minds. Still, something inside him steadied, firm and unshakable. When Richard ended the call and turned away dismissively, Evan finally spoke. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It carried the quiet weight of someone who had lost everything once and survived anyway. He said he understood the concern. That responsibility didn't disappear when life got complicated, it multiplied. He said being a single father hadn't taken anything away from his professionalism, it had sharpened it. Richard scoffed, already reaching for his headset again, certain the matter was settled. That was when Avon added, almost gently, that before any final decision was made, there was something Richard should know about the aircraft itself. The sentence landed softly but carried an unexpected gravity, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Richard didn't respond immediately. He didn't even look up. But somewhere deep beneath his certainty, something shifted. The cockpit felt suddenly smaller, quieter, as if the plane were listening. Evan stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, waiting, not for permission, not for approval, but for the truth to finally be seen. Richard finally turned, irritation still etched across his face, but now laced with a flicker of curiosity he didn't care to admit. He crossed his arms, the gold stripes on his sleeves catching the cockpit light, as if to remind everyone who held authority here. "What exactly could you possibly need to tell me about this aircraft?" he asked, his tone sharp, dismissive, already expecting an excuse or a plea. Avon didn't flinch. He took a slow breath, as though steadying himself not for confrontation, but for honesty. His fingers brushed the edge of the control panel with something close to reverence, not ownership, but familiarity. He began speaking quietly, and the calm in his voice forced Richard to listen despite himself. Avon spoke of 5 years earlier, of a night when a phone call shattered his life, when the woman he loved was gone in an instant, and the world he'd built collapsed without warning. He spoke of holding a newborn daughter with one arm, while signing hospital papers with the other, of grief so heavy it made breathing feel like work. Richard shifted uncomfortably, unused to personal stories in the cockpit, but Evan continued, not dramatizing, not seeking sympathy. He explained how life had demanded decisions he'd never planned for, how insurance settlements and investments forced him to learn quickly, to think strategically not just for survival, but for a future he refused to let tragedy steal from his child. Evan talked about taking risks, not reckless ones, but calculated leaps grounded in research, instinct, and an unbreakable sense of responsibility. He mentioned partnering with engineers, aviation consultants, and financial advisors, learning an entirely new language while still flying, still parenting, still showing up. Richard's irritation softened into confusion as Evan revealed that one of those investments had been in a private aviation ownership group focused on modernizing fleets and prioritizing safety. Evan paused, meeting Richard's eyes directly now, and said that the aircraft they were standing in was part of that group's flagship program. Richard felt a faint chill crawl up his spine, but his pride held firm. Ownership groups were complex, distant things, boards, names, suits. Avon let the silence breathe before adding the detail that shattered the illusion completely. He was not just an investor, but the majority stakeholder. The words struck like sudden turbulence. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Color drained from his face, his mind scrambling for footing. He looked around the cockpit. The controls, the panels, the very plane he trusted his life to, now recontextualized through a truth he hadn't seen coming. Avon continued gently, explaining that he had never sought recognition, that he kept his name off press releases intentionally. He didn't want power, he wanted impact. After his wife's death, he'd realized how thin the margin for error was, how lives depended on systems designed by people who sometimes forgot the human cost of fatigue and shortcuts. He spoke about investing in aircraft upgrades, better training programs, and revised scheduling models that allowed pilots to actually rest, to be present for their families without compromising safety. Richard felt the weight of his earlier words crush inward. All his assumptions about weakness, distraction, divided focus crumbled. The man he had dismissed as a liability had quietly been shaping the very standards Richard prided himself on. Richard stammered an apology, words tumbling over each other, stripped of their usual confidence. He admitted he'd judged too quickly, that he'd let his own sacrifices turn into a measuring stick for everyone else. Avon listened, expression calm but guarded, and when Richard finished, Avon raised a hand, not to silence him but to steady the moment. He said this wasn't about embarrassment or hierarchy. It was about understanding. He spoke of Lily again, of her belief that planes were magical because they brought people home. Every decision Evan made, in business and in the cockpit, carried her face in mind. Being a single father hadn't made him careless. It had made him relentless about safety. Richard felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, a mix of shame and awe. The cockpit door remained closed. The world outside paused as if waiting. When operations called again, asking for a final decision, Richard swallowed hard. His voice, once unshakable, wavered slightly as he confirmed the flight would proceed as scheduled, with Evan Brooks as his copilot. As he ended the call, Richard realized something profound had shifted. Not just the flight, but his understanding of strength itself.